Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trish Burke. I'm a trainer with the Department of State, and I'm co-presenting today with Ebony Mapp. Behind the scenes, we have our moderator and host, Christopher Eastman, who's also the training supervisor. And also behind the scenes, we have David Jacobson. So thank you for attending. The goal of this presentation this afternoon is to provide you with a broad overview of the review, the SEQR process itself, and hopefully we'll try to demystify your role as review board members. You may hear the terms SEQRA and SEQR. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but the SEQR, when it has the R in the end, refers to the process itself, and SEQRA with the A in the end, the A is for act, that refers to the legislation. So it doesn't really matter which term that you use. The legislature made SEQR self-enforcing, and that means that each agency of government is responsible to see that they are following their own obligations to comply with the SEQR regs themselves. And while DEC is charged with issuing regulations with the SEQR process, DEC itself has no authority to review the implementation of SEQR by any other agency. So in other words, there are no SEQR police. Anyone with standing, that is somebody who believes they are harmed by the decision of the review board, they can file an Article 78, which means essentially they are suing the municipality. So that is the only recourse that they have. Now we're going to be taking a look at the rules of the road. You should hear us speaking by now, and if you don't, check your audio settings in the drop-down at the top of the program window. If it's still not working, log out and log back in, but try not to do that too many times. You could foul up the system. And we're not IT professionals. We're off-site working from home, which means we can't assist you with any technical issues on your end. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the chat feature that Chris already described, and use that pull-down menu, select host, panelists, and presenters. That's the fourth option in that chat box. Or you could address your question to all panelists, and that way everyone sees it. And we'll try to answer as many questions as time permits. If we can't, you can always email us for technical assistance at localgov@dos.ny.gov. Certificates will be mailed to participants in the next week, but beware, WebEx is watching. While we can't actually see you, we can see your level of attention. So if you wander off the screen to do something else, we can't see what it is, but we can see that you're not paying attention. And those who log in late or leave early may only receive partial credit according to the level of attention. And now we're going to do a PSA for the census. Yes, the 2020 census is still ongoing. And it's a count of every living resident in the United States. That includes people who are not citizens. As long as they're living here, they're going to get counted. It's mandated by Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution, and it's been happening every 10 years since 1790. And the goal of the census is to count everyone just once and to count them in the right place. The 2020 census is critical to New York's future. It impacts $53 billion in federal funding for the community services and economic development. It impacts the number of congressional seats and redistricting. The last census, New Yorkers were undercounted, and we were penalized by that because we lost 2 congressional seats as a result. The data used as a result of the census are used in government and local planning and businesses for the next 10 years. This includes updating your comprehensive plan, that demographic section. So it's really critical that we get an accurate count. But we have a lot of challenges to a full count. There are hard to count communities. Traditionally, those have been people in very urban and very urban areas, people with low income, children under 5, seniors, people who have limited English proficiency, also people in non-traditional housing. That could be transient populations or you know, kids living with different parents in different times of the weeks, or people that have moved back in with their parents, or just people living together as a family unit. And also sometimes there are challenges with accessing the technology. This year you can fill out your census, you know, on your iPhone or your computer, and that can be tough for people that don't have those technologies or they have limited computer skills. And another challenge to account is, you know, sometimes people are just distrustful of the government and they don't want to provide information about who they are or where they live. Here's the census timeline. We are at the end here, down in that August to October. By now, if you have not responded to your census, you should have received a postcard in the mail telling you that an enumerator will come in person to do a follow-up. Another important date here, year here, is 2021, and that's the final enumeration count that is due to the White House. So pandemic or not, the census carries on. And New York's response rate is not so great so far. We can do a lot better. As of October 4th, we have a 63.8% response rate. And that's lower than the rest of the nation. And if you take a look at this color chart of New York State, you can kind of see where your county falls. So if you're not doing as well as you should be, it's not too late, and always spread the word and get the word out that you should be not fearful of this, and go ahead and do your part and complete your census. Here's some general information if you want to respond online. Here's the census, the website for the census, and then New York has its own website for the census. And if you wanted to speak to somebody, you have questions, here's a different phone number. If you want to report a scam, you can call our Division of Consumer Protection hotline. It's really important to remember that nobody will be asking you for your Social Security number or for your banking account number or for anything that has to do with money. These should be red flags and potentially scams that you should alert others to and report them as scams. And so now I am going to give the ball to my coworker, my colleague, Ebony Mapp. Hopefully. Let me try to do that again. It got away from me. Sorry.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Trish?
Yes.
Okay, great. That was wonderful, wonderful introduction, Trish. I almost interrupted you and just told a little lie saying that, you know, actually we can see everyone's screen and where you're going on your computer, but I thought that might upset some folks, so decided not to. But anyway, we're just going to jump into SEQR at this point. So SEQR itself is not an approval or a denial. It's not a decision. It's basically an information gathering process. And Trish mentioned that earlier. That's something that we like to hone in on and kind of beat to death because, you know, SEQR for a lot of people can be confusing about what to focus on or how they're supposed to use it. And in feeling that way, sometimes the result is that some boards try to skip it altogether, and that is very unwise. It can lead to dangerous or irreversible problems in a community or costly legal fees. So, like if it ends up in court, which is very likely if it's a controversial case. But that's, again, that's why we want to make it really clear this is an information gathering process. It's nothing to be afraid of or deterred by. It's just a way to give you more information so that you can make an informed decision on an application. So the goal of SEQR is to identify the environmental factors involved in an action and incorporate them into the agency's decision-making process as early as possible. This is so that any negative impacts that are discovered can be weighed and mitigated on the front end and not at the end of the process when the problems and impacts are either unavoidable or have already happened. Keep in mind, though, that SEQR defines the environment very broadly. So, yes, it includes what we would typically think of initially, like land, air, water, et cetera, but it also includes resources that you might not normally think of, like a playground, for instance, like in this photo here. One of the photos on our slide shows a playground. That's a recreational resource or a health-related resource. Environment also includes scenic views, farmland, wildlife habitat, or even neighborhood character. These are all valuable components of our environment that could all easily be affected by an agency's decision. So SEQR, the purpose of SEQR is to help you take all of those different types of, well, different aspects or components of environment and take them into account when you're making a decision. So through the lens of SEQR, environmental resources that can be affected by an action are, like I said before, very broad, and that includes all those listed on this slide. So resources that are of agricultural or historic, aesthetic, or archaeological significance. I mean, that could be an indigenous burial ground. It could be a variety of things. Existing patterns of population concentration, distribution, or growth. So changes to the in and out migration of people in a community. It could also be existing community or a neighborhood character, like in that picture on the last slide. I'll go back really quickly. You can see that this may be like a little commercial corridor, or maybe a central business district in a small community, and there's some character there. I mean, aesthetically, I'm not an architect, but you know, there's kind of a quaint feel here, and so that's something that you may want to take into consideration when making a decision on an application that comes before you, that the character of that particular area. Human health, land, air, water, minerals, flora and fauna, noise, which could be subjective, right? This is why it makes sense to have regulations that kind of dictate sound levels and what's appropriate in a community versus what isn't. View shed, we already mentioned that, and dark skies. In a lot of communities, particularly those in more rural areas, you know, that's an asset that many people want to retain, the ability to look up out into the sky at night and to actually be able to see the plethora of stars that are out there, and not be distracted or have that muted by lights from the ground, which is typical in more urban places. So what are actions? Actions are activities that are subject to SEQR. I mean, it's that basic. Sometimes the activity is funded or directly undertaken by an agency. Other times, it can be the adoption of a policy or rule or plan, regulation or procedure by an agency, or it can be an activity that is simply the authority to approve, deny, or apply conditions to a request. That's basically called a discretionary action. And that comes into play when we're talking about issuing permits, a license, doing a site plan review, an approval, things like that. Those are discretionary actions. Let's do, or any combination of the above. So let's move on to do a little breakdown, a quick breakdown of how SEQR works. And there's more involved in than what this lays out. There's more steps here, but we'll cover that as we move forward throughout the course. So first, an agency either proposes an action themselves or they receive an application that's under their normal jurisdiction. The action is then classified. That's where we're determining what category does it fall into. Is it a type 1, a type 2, is it unlisted? And again, we'll get into this in more detail later. Now, depending on how it's classified, the SEQR may stop right then and there. And again, we will get into that in more detail in a moment. But that only applies to one particular action. The other two, SEQR will just continue as normal. The lead agency is then established, and then that lead agency, either by themselves or in concert with other involved agencies, determine the significance of the action. Again, depending on how this turns out, the SEQR process may end right here. But if not, then an environmental impact statement is needed, or it may become required, particularly if it's a positive declaration is arrived at, and there's been some indication or it's clear that there will be some significantly adverse impact that will arise from the proposed action. But moving on, after the EIS is accepted, the agency has to prepare findings, which is basically their rationale as to why they concluded, why they came to the conclusions that they did, and and then have the agency's decision included as well. SEQR ends here. And then here's a little a flow chart that kind of lays this out, I think, more clearly. So this is what happens once you classify the action. That's at the very top of the screen. It's classified as either type 1, unlisted, or a type 2 action. Now, if it's a type 1 action, that requires a full environmental assessment form. Well, again, we'll get into that in more detail later. That's going to be an action that the potential is likely that there will be a significant adverse environmental impact. And so we want to get as much information as possible on the front end so that we can do a thorough review and see if there's going to be, if there's going to be ways to mitigate it or if there aren't. If it's an unlisted action, a short environmental assessment form is needed, or they can do the full if they so choose, or if the lead agency requires it. But that's the next step there. And then, of course, for the type 2 action, if it's a type 2, there's no review. That's where we end SEQR. And again, we'll get into all this in more detail, but very quickly, I'll just say that there is a coordinated review that is required if you have a type 1 action. That's not required for an unlisted action, but again, there's caveats to this, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But you'll review the criteria and determine the significance, issue either a positive or a negative declaration, and then if it's a positive declaration, move on to scoping and the preparation of a draft EIS. So, you know, it's up to you. I mean, you may prefer to use the chart. It's a little easier to understand that way. But I will pass this on to Trish, who will get into detail about what type 2 and type 1 and unlisted actions include.
Thank you, Ebony. Well, if your head is spinning, I'm not surprised because it's a lot of information to take in between those last two slides, the flow chart and the bulleted list. They both present the same information, but in different formats depending on, you know, what's easier for you to take a look at. You know, SEQR has its own language almost. There are a lot of acronyms and a lot of terms that you won't see elsewhere in New York State, you know, the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, and there are all kinds of things. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, hang in there. We're going to be trudging through it a little deeper as we continue. This is also a good time to remind you that we gave you some handouts. We provided a PDF of the handouts of the slides in the show. Not only that, but in the back, we should have parts of the legislation that identify what is a type 1 action, a type 2 action, and an unlisted action. So if you need to flip through to the end and follow along at those lists of things, that's fine. Just know that we provided them for you in advance. So what is the type 2 action? So type 2 actions are those actions without a significant adverse environmental impact or actions which have been statutorily exempted from SEQR. It's important to know that no significant impact does not mean no impact. So it's presumed that every project is going to have an environmental impact. You know, after that, it's like how big is it or what is the magnitude, but it's presumed that everything is going to have an environmental impact, but will it be an adverse environmental impact? Who knows? That's for you to figure out. Type 2 actions do not require the preparation of an EAF, the Environmental Assessment Form, or a negative declaration or a positive declaration, or even an environmental impact statement. If the proposed action is a type 2 action, then there's no further review and SEQR is concluded. It's important for you to remember, like if we go back, let me go back to Ebony's bulleted list. See these red asterisks? Anytime you see one of these asterisks, it means that the SEQR can come to its natural conclusion, but you have to make sure that you note that in the application or the meeting minutes. And that way, going forward, if you're challenged or if you have a question, people will know that you didn't overlook this and you didn't forget to do SEQR. It's just that SEQR came to its natural conclusion. So depending upon how that action is classified, it will determine the review path going forward, whether you're going to be doing the Type 1 review, the unlisted review, or the Type 2 action. And until January 1st, 2019, there were 37 items on the Type 2 list. And as a result of the new SEQR amendments, we keep saying new, even though it's closing in on the end of 2020, now there are 54 items on that list. So the list has been added to, and the whole idea is to enhance the review, so you'll come up with a better project in the end. So how do you always remember if it's a Type 2 action? In my little head, I always say, Type 2, no further review. How's that? As a little memory device, because it doesn't work with Type 1. You have to say, Type 2, no further review. There you go. So Type 1 actions, these are a little different. A Type 1 action, these are defined as having at least one significant adverse environmental impact. They're listed in the SEQR regs, or they can be listed in the involved agency's SEQR procedures. An easy way to remember a Type 1 action is that these actions contain numeric thresholds, numeric triggers. For example, any action that equals or exceeds one or more of the thresholds listed can result in a Type 1 designation. Type 1 actions always require you to complete a full environmental assessment form. So there are two versions of this form, the short form and the full. And, you know, the reason is it's got a little more detail in it. And as Ebony said, SEQR is a collection of review materials. So the more information and data you can collect on a project, the better your decision is going to be in the end. So it's an information gathering session. And Type 1 actions always require the completion of the full EAF and a coordinated review if more than one agency is involved. So if you remember that flow chart, you have to decide, are you going it alone with one agency, or are others going to help you along the way? And if more than one agency is going to be chiming in and helping you with this review process, then you have to coordinate and so that you have an organized application. However, a Type 1 designation doesn't mean that an environmental impact statement must be prepared. One example of a Type 1 action is the adoption of a comprehensive plan. So if you're adopting your plan or zoning or amending your zoning, these automatically trigger a Type 1 action. In terms of construction projects, thresholds differ depending on the type of project and other factors, such as whether or not you have zoning or subdivision regulations, or even if the project will require connecting to existing public sewer and public water systems. And a Type 1 designation requires that SEQR continues to its natural conclusion. Unlisted actions, so all actions not identified as a Type 1 or a Type 2 action are considered unlisted action. In other words, they fall between the two listed categories. And again, at the end of your handouts, we have the Type 1, the Type 2, and the unlisted actions spelled out for you. And the governing board can officially adopt a new list or add to their list of unlisted action. They can do that by resolution, but we always prefer that something be adopted by local law, because then it will have a lot of strength behind it, more strength than just simply adopting something by resolution. If they would like an unlisted action to be classified as a Type 1 or a Type 2. No agency is bound by an action on another agency's Type 2 list, but they are bound to it if it is on the agency's Type 1 list. And an unlisted action requires SEQR continue to its conclusion. Again, go back to that flow chart from Ebony, and how you classify the action determines the review path. So if you've determined that it's an unlisted action, you know, It's not found in the type 1 or the type 2, and you're going to have to follow this complete SEQRA process until the end, so no shortcuts. Now now we're going on to agencies. Now that we've discussed what needs to be reviewed, let's talk about who has a role in the review process. And those public bodies having a stake in an action would be considered agencies for the purpose of SEQR. So remember, agencies mean state or local entities. They are not federal because SEQR is a New York State process. And at the federal level, we have NEPA, but this is a New York thing, so they have to be state or local agency. And this is just a short list of people that are typically considered involved agencies. They're the usual examples. For example, a planning board or a ZBA, a town board, a county health department. They usually, will chime in on septic systems, school boards, your local development corporations or IDAs, or another state agencies. These can all be involved, so they will have direct consideration over this project. An interested agency, they don't have a direct hand in the project, but they may have specialized information, or they may want to keep their hand in the project just to stay on top of it because they have special interests or background information. These can include state or local agencies, and they act as an advisory capacity. So they're giving you advice and information. This could be your county board or your regional agency, or it can even be an environmental management or a conservation advisory council, a CAC. What's not considered a SEQR agency? Any federal department or agency, such as the Army Corps of Engineers, or any private entity, like a not-for-profit. They could be private developers. Remember, it's only state and local agencies that have to do with SEQR. And now I will this is my slide, sorry. So it's a good idea to have a timeline for yourselves or a checklist or even a notification packet. If you really want to be a user-friendly local government, it keeps yourself organized, but it also helps the applicant if you can see the timeline because the SEQR dates become very important. Local government officials seem to, sorry about that. The agency that first proposes the action, or whoever is the first to receive the application, they are responsible for contacting all of the other involved agencies. It's their job to distribute the environmental assessment form, Part 1, and the application, and it's also their job to inform the that a lead agency has to be established. So remember, we only want one lead agency, one entity shepherding this process through to fruition. And that lead agency has to be established within 30 days. And once it's established, the lead agency must make their determination of significance within 20 days. So determination of significance is another one of those important phrases unique to SEQR. It's where you finally take all the information that you have and you say, yeah, there will be an impact, but just what is the magnitude and duration of that impact? What's it actually going to be? And they have to make that decision within 20 days. And local government officials seem to have a hard time with the concept of having 20 days to make that SEQR determination of significance when the county can take 30 days for their 239 county review. And you have to remember that the county, not being an involved agency, has nothing to do with the SEQR review. So now I will return it to Ebony.
Okay. So now let's talk about the determinations of significance in local review. The SEQR must conclude before statutory decisions. Basically, so think of it this way. An agency is triggered to do SEQR because they have received either an application or, well, an application where that agency has the power to approve or deny it, right? Or they're undertaking an action or about to grant some, or poised to grant some funding or something of that sort. But an agency can't take action or fund the program or make the decision on the application or whatever it is until the application is complete. The application is not complete until the SEQR assessment is complete, right? So when is the SEQR assessment complete? When either a negative declaration is determined and filed, or a positive declaration and a draft environmental impact statement is accepted for public review and a notice of completion has been filed. So it's one of those two options, right? Either there's a negative declaration that is issued and filed, or a positive declaration along with the draft environmental impact statement that has been accepted for public review and a notice of completion has been filed. Now keep in mind the draft environmental impact statement does not have to be accepted just because it's submitted. If it is unsatisfactory or inadequately addresses the environmental impacts or has other deficiencies, the lead agency doesn't have to accept it, not until it is satisfactory. And remember, SEQR must be completed prior to the review and approval of the original application or the original action that was going to be undertaken, like grant funding or what have you. And that's true for law changes, subdivision, site plans, and special use permits. So a completed application, or a completed SEQR, rather, looks like the following. There's either a local submission requirements have been satisfied for a type 1 or unlisted action, and a negative declaration or conditioned negative declaration has been issued, or a positive declaration has been issued and a satisfactory draft EIS has been accepted. Let me say that one more time. A completed application looks like either one of these two options. There's a local submission requirement that has been satisfied for a type 1 or unlisted action, and a negative declaration or conditioned negative declaration has been issued, or that's one option, or the second option is a positive declaration has been issued and a satisfactory draft environmental impact statement has been accepted. That constitutes a complete application. Once it's complete, public hearing must happen within 52 calendar days maximum for all subdivision, special use permits, and site plans. For subdivision, SEQR is directly included into the preliminary and final plat approvals, and these are the sections of law that comes to it's listed specifically in the law. However, SEQR is still a separate review from the subdivision, right? Both are required, though. So SEQR is separate from the actual subdivision review, but SEQR is required as part of addressing the subdivision application. And timing for the decision may differ depending on whether the planning board acts as a lead agency or whether an EIS is required. So let's take a look at our determinations of significance. First, we'll talk about the negative declaration. That basically means that either there were likely no impacts were identified, or the identified impacts weren't significant, or there were significant impacts, or there were significant impacts identified rather, but they were mitigated or sufficiently mitigated. Basically that there's nothing to be gained by analyzing the impacts any further. That's basically what that means. A negative declaration is saying, you know, we've looked at this, there's nothing here that's egregious or anything that we have to look into any further. There's nothing to be gained by any more digging into this, and an environmental impact statement will not be needed. That's basically what it means. Now, the negative, although you're saying that, okay, there's no issue here, it still needs to be written and described. It needs to be described and included in the paperwork. So basically you have to be detailed and include your rationale for coming to that conclusion. You're addressing each potential impact, you are describing the mitigation measures that have been proposed, and you're explaining how both of those items support your decision or your conclusion regarding the negative declaration. So it's not simply enough to just say, okay, we're going to give this negative declaration. You need to go into detail as to why and explain that in writing. you also want to incorporate the classification, whether it's type 1 or unlisted, et cetera, and the negative declaration in any required subsequent legal notice. So that means that if, as a lead agency, you would be required to publish a legal notice for the application, then that notice should include or must include the negative declaration and the classification, either type 1 or unlisted. And then SEQR ends here if the project has a negative declaration. Next, we'll talk about condition declarations. That's basically a negative declaration with conditions, right? If you're on a board that's reviewed special use permits or even site plans, you may attach conditions to either of those approvals. It's a similar kind of thing. So a negative declaration with conditions can only be issued under certain conditions or circumstances. That's when you have an unlisted action, had a coordinated review, and submitted a full EAF. I'll say that one more time. You can only issue the condition negative declaration under certain circumstances. That's when you have, 1, an unlisted action, 2, have had a coordinated review among the involved agencies, and have received a full EAF. You see that? I hope you can see the evidence of due diligence here. That's kind of the point. Basically, a condition negative declaration can be issued if the imposed conditions that you're attaching to it will mitigate or avoid significant impacts. It's basically an alternative to issuing a positive declaration, but you're saying it doesn't get to that level because we can identify ways that this can be mitigated. So ways that those significant impacts can be mitigated, so we'll give it a condition negative declaration. And you can wrap up SEQR at this point, really. You also have to publish a notice in the environmental notice bulletin and have at least 30 days for public comment, and the notice must note that it must include the conditions that you've attached to the negative declaration. An agency can also publish its own notice. If you're an agency that publishes your own notice separate from the ENB, then, and when I say ENB, I mean the Environmental Notice Bulletin. But if you're an agency that publishes your own notice, you're welcome to do that as well. It cannot be done in substitute for the ENB public notice, but if you want to do that in addition to the ENB, you're certainly welcome to do that, as long as your notice also complies with the requirement to have at least 30 days for public comments, and that the conditions imposed on the negative declaration are also included in that notice. And I should note that the CND, or the conditional negative declaration, must be rescinded and reissued if, as a positive declaration, if the comments claim that the mitigation will not accomplish their goal. So, for instance, maybe there's a deficiency in what the mitigation measures were proposed would do for the significant adverse impact. Maybe the mitigation measures aren't adequate, and you have a substantive amount of comments that are claiming that, and you'll need to rescind that CND and, like I said, reissue it as a positive declaration instead. And having said that, let's move on to the positive declaration. So SEQR is intended for the lead agency to apply a very low threshold for issuing a positive declaration. This is so that you can pick up on as many potential impacts as possible. So the positive declaration basically means that the proposed action could cause at least one significant adverse environmental impact. So an environmental impact statement is required to further evaluate the possible negative impacts. You want to keep in mind that if the review is uncoordinated, a positive declaration from any involved agency that the SEQR, let me just go back and restate that. If the review is uncoordinated, a positive declaration from any involved agency requires that the SEQR process begin anew, start over, and be a coordinated review. If any of the involved agencies haven't already issued a final decision at that point, they must wait until the final EIS is finished. Next, Trish will talk about the environmental impact statement and what it should include. And I'll pass the ball to Trish.
Thank you. Chris, do you think this is a good time to take some questions I see coming in before we move on to the next question?
Good thinking, Trish. I was going to interrupt to try to, before we get too far along, to address these really important questions. There are a number of things about SEQR that are really confusing and don't make a whole lot of sense, but it's just the way they are, at least the way they are right now. And one of them is, and a lot of the strangeness of SEQR has to do with the determination of significance and the timing. Trish, if you want to move back, if you want to scroll back to the slide about the, I guess it's the, yes, that one.
Whoops, one
Right.
back?
It's, yeah, determination of, the one that has the deadlines of 20, this one. The lead agency, yeah, this is a really strange thing. The lead agency must be established within 30 days. This is where I always stop and really explore these details here. The lead agency must be established within 30 days. And that's a really strange thing because it's strange that you get more than, and then the determination of significance is within 20 days. And it's really strange that the establishment of lead agency, you have a whole 30 days, but then you actually have less time to really determine the future of this application. And the results of the SEQR process. The lead agency can usually be established very easily. That's almost, it's in only relatively rare cases is there a lead agency dispute. It's usually fairly cut and dry, and it doesn't take 30 days. But the determination of significance really, it could mean that the review all told is a couple months or many months, if not more than a year. So this is one of those strange things about SEQR, and that latter, the 20-day determination of significance, a lot of the time there's no consequence to violating that 20 days. You should try to stick with it, but if the board needs more information, most applicants will be inclined to provide more information to the board because their goal is a negative declaration. They don't want to, your project sponsor has a goal of not doing a full-blown environmental impact statement. So the county referral, and there have been, the questions have to do with county referral, that is completely separate from these timelines. Nowhere in statute, it's in a case that you only have to send the application materials and part 1 of the EAF to the county planning agency. So only the application materials, not your response. That doesn't have to go to the county planning agency. You could do, once the county responds, you can, or you could make a determination of significance in theory before you receive the county's response to the 239, to the full statement. And if you do, you're not taking in necessarily the county's comments. Better to have them, but in theory you could make that determination of significance before you hear back from the county. If it's a positive declaration, then the county will be an interested agency for even, unless of course it's the county that's the project sponsor, for example. So I hope that's not confusing too many people. But I responded a couple times in chat to the questions, and I thought maybe we should pause to discuss this further. So the county referral timeline is completely separate from the SEQR timeline. And for purposes of the complete application, as Ebony explained so well, the complete application, that when you have a complete application, a negative declaration, or a draft environmental impact statement, that's when your clock starts for the 62 days for within which time you must have a public hearing. So if anybody has other questions, write them in on that, write them in, and we'll try to address them later on. But thanks for pausing, Trish, and back to you.
It is very confusing. I almost feel like we should have a separate slide on that going forward, but we'll talk about that. So next we're going to talk about the SEQR regulations that were updated and modified, an important part of this presentation. So the 2018 SEQR amendments to the regulations that implement SEQR and streamline the SEQR process were adopted June 27, 2018, and they went into effect on January 1st, 2019. If you want to search for them online, you can just do SEQR revisions in quote, and the express terms are the SEQR regulations. Now, we've included the language in your handouts. As with any legislation, you want to check for what's bracketed and what's underlined. Anything that's new has been underlined, and the terms, phrases, and everything else, sections that have been deleted, appear in brackets. So it's easy for you to figure out what those actual amendments or changes are. You don't have to look too hard. They'll be underlined for you. So why did we have SEQR? Why do we have a need for these updated information? Well, among other changes, DEC adopted the amendments to Type 1 and Type 2 list of actions, as well as the scoping and the acceptance procedures for a draft environmental impact statement. DEC also modernized the regulations related to web publications and documents, and a generic EIS is a type of an EIS that's typically used to consider broad-based actions or related groups of actions that an agency may approve, fund, or undertake. So maybe if you remember a few years ago when hydraulic fracturing was a pressing issue, DEC issued a generic EIS on that because it was an issue that covered a large part of the state, not just one parcel or one neighborhood. And sometimes a generic EIS will also be issued for a comprehensive plan because it's for, a particular municipality or a big chunk of that municipality. And the last time that we had any SEQR changes, let's see, I think back in the early 1970s to mid-19, I think 1975, SEQR was adopted. And this was a change, a big time of change in the nation. We adopted the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Keep America Beautiful. So people were finally really interested in taking charge of the environment and what impacts projects potentially would have on the impact. And then we didn't have any more changes until about 1985 or so. But it's about time that we had amendments to the SEQR, and it takes a long time, usually it takes a long time in New York State to make any legislative changes. So on the Type 1 list, again, you will see these changes on your handouts. We lowered the thresholds that will trigger SEQR for residential subdivisions. It was lowered from 250 down to 200 units when they were connected to public water or a sewer system in municipalities of less than 150,000 persons. We added a threshold for parking spaces in smaller communities. For example, now it's parking for 500 vehicles in a municipality with less than 150,000 people in population. And it aligned the threshold for historic properties with other sensitive resources and now as eligible historic properties. And for example, any unlisted action that exceeds 25% of any threshold in the Type 1 list occurring within or substantially continuous, I think that should be contiguous, to a historic structure or a district. I think we didn't mention that, all of these DEC regulations are available online at the DEC's website. There is an online mapper, which is pretty handy. You can just put in the property or the application's address or the section, block, and lot, or you can use the pen and, draw your own outline of the designated areas. And then you just hit enter, and it's cross-referenced with all of these maps and resources that DEC has. And one of those maps and resources will be historic properties and districts and structures. They will show up on that mapper. Because it used to be a board would get an application before them, and they'd think, how do we know if this is in a historic area or what these cultural or archaeological assets are? Thank goodness now you have the EAS mapper, and it does all of that background research for you. So that's a pretty good thing to have on the Type 1 list now as well. So let me go to the next slide. So I'm sorry if I didn't advance that slide, if I was talking about that already. We just did that one. So for the Type 2 list, here we have the Type 2 list is the reuse of, it is upgrading buildings to meet the New York State Energy Code. So this is a really important thing as New York State is trying to adapt to use more renewable energies and green infrastructure and renewable technologies. We wanted to expand this list, and so if you were upgrading a building to meet the state energy code, now it would fall under the Type 2 list. We have a definition for green infrastructure. We didn't have that definition 25 years ago. We now have the installation of telecommunication cables in rights-of-ways with trenchless burial, or if you're using existing poles. We have conveyances of land in connection with a 1, 2, or 3 family residence. And solar is another big issue that is emerging all over New York State. So whether it be on a rooftop or a landfill or a brownfield or on a Superfund site, in a wastewater treatment facility, if it's on, a rooftop or on the land of a parking lot or a garage in industrial areas, these are all considered Type 2 actions. And another example on the Type 2 list is a lot line adjustment. This is not, when you have a lot line adjustment, you are not creating a new parcel or a new lot. You're just changing the size and shape. So maybe Ebony wants to build something on her parcel, but she doesn't have enough land, and I live next door. And she says, can I buy 20 feet so that I can fulfill my setback requirement? We would do a lot line adjustment. We would not be doing a subdivision to create a brand new parcel. We have some more things continued on the Type 2 listing, and this includes the reuse of a commercial or a residential structure. So this is adaptive reuse. This is a good thing. Well, we like to say the greenest building is one that's already there. So you're not breaking ground on green land. You're using what's already there where the infrastructure is already in place. 239M or 239N, so these are county reviews, planning recommendations, or if you were acquiring or dedicating parkland or conservation easements, again, these are considered good things for the community, and so they are on the Type 2 list. And anytime you have a conveyance of a property by a public auction, especially, the zombie properties or the land banks, when you see parcels and buildings going up for public auctions, you want to get these projects moving quickly so that they become assets to your communities. And finally, we have organic digesters that are operating on municipal landfill. Again, these are considered good things for the environment, and so they can be on the Type 2. Remember, type 2, a shorter review. There you go. And now Ebony will talk about determining the significance of a project.
And Ebony, before you get into it, and you're still muted, maybe we should finish addressing questions about the public hearing, the complete application, and involving the public in the determination of significance. There was one point that somebody caught that I didn't make. It was a question right after I finished a little earlier. The other strange part of the complete application and the difference in the parallel track, but not the coordinated track of county referral, the separateness of that review, is that the required public hearing is after the determination of significance. For SEQR purposes, you need not have a public hearing before making a determination of significance. That's another really strange thing about SEQR. Most people think correctly it would make sense to hold a public hearing before making that determination of significance, that all important, as our retired principal attorney used to say, that all-important determination of significance, which has so much influence on the fate of a project, the SEQR fate of a project. So many boards, when the application is controversial and substantial, will opt to have a public hearing before they make a determination of significance, all but guaranteeing that they don't make that 20-day deadline for actually making a determination of significance. They will have a public hearing, they'll take the comments by the public, and then they'll make a determination of significance. And then down the road, after that determination of significance, they'll have a second public hearing on the application, and that required public hearing. But make sure if you have that voluntary public hearing, if you opt to have the public hearing before the determination of significance, make sure you have the required public hearing after the determination of significance. This is so confusing and frustrating that a number of county planners have suggested that we try to change this rule so that the required public hearing is before the determination of significance. We haven't gotten very far down that road. But if you feel like it doesn't make sense, there's a good reason for that. It doesn't really make sense, and a lot of people feel the same way, and a lot of people are confused by that. And we will keep you posted if anything changes in that regard. But keep in mind, you finish SEQR. The rules are that you finish SEQR before having a public hearing, but you can choose to have a public hearing before you finish SEQR. So sorry for the interruption. Back to you, Ebony.
No, that was great. Thank you. Okay, so next we'll talk about how the lead agency will determine the significance of a proposed action in the next few slides. First, we'll talk about the environmental assessment form. Now, this is the key tool in determining whether a proposed action poses an adverse environmental impact. There's two versions of it, and Trish already mentioned this, some of this to some degree, but I'll go over it again. There's two versions. There's a short environmental assessment form and what's called a full or long environmental assessment form. They are both used to collect data because, remember, SEQR is an information gathering process. Both of those, both the short EAF and the full or long EAF have been revised to accommodate new areas of environmental concern. We'll touch on some of those a little bit later. Now, the short environmental assessment form, or from this point forward, I'm just going to say EAF because it's easier to not get tongue-tied. The short EAF is used for type 1 in unlisted actions, but the lead agency can require a full or long EAF for unlisted actions. Now, if you look at this chart under short EAF, you'll notice the absence of type 2 on that chart, right? That's because the short EAF applies to or is available to be used for type 1 and unlisted actions only. It was expanded from 2 pages to 4 pages with new questions that added, that were added to provide greater depth. And as far as I can tell and from what I've learned thus far, these additions are widely considered to be an improvement, again, because they provide greater depth. And the full or long EAF is used for all type 1 actions across the board. It can also be used for unlisted actions at the lead agency's discretion. Now, this form was already long. It was 21 pages, and it was expanded to 25. But again, both the short and long EAFs have been revised to accommodate new areas of environmental concern, and that can include things like pedestrian accessibility, cyclist accessibility, things like that. Move on. Now, both forms are set up the same exact way. They're divided into 3 parts. The first part is for the project information. That's completed by, or it's the responsibility of the project sponsor or the applicant to complete that portion. It's based on all the currently available info, and that's what Trish was talking about earlier, where you can use the EAF mapper. You just plug in the address or draw a box around the parcel that you're focused on, and it'll kind of push out all this information. This is the part where this is particularly helpful. But this part 1 is based on, like I said, the currently available information, and it can include you can also include supplemental information. So the applicant or project sponsor, whomever, can include design, studies, maps, et cetera, to supplement that information that was populated by the EAF mapper. And it is subject to verification. So again, that's another reason why it just makes sense to use the EAF mapper. That's something that has been lauded as a really beneficial and helpful addition to SEQR, is having access to that mapper, because you can pretty much be assured that all the information there is current, and you don't have to spend a lot of time, or the applicant rather doesn't have to spend a lot of time compiling information from a variety of sources and spending the money and or time or other resources to do so. It's all from one spot, and it's the most currently available. It's the most accurate information available at that time. So that's part 1. Part 2, that covers the impacts and their magnitude. Now, this part is completed by the lead agency, as well as part 3. We'll get into that in a sec. But part 2 is the largest section of both of the forms. And they are largely based on, the questions in part 2 are largely based on part 1 of the form, or the project information part of the form. Now, part 2 questions highlight the potentially adverse impacts that need further review. So the idea there is to, part 2 basically helps you gauge whether it's a small impact, a moderate impact, or a large impact. And it's the evaluation of moderate to large impacts that are identified in part 2. In part 3, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead of myself. But anyway, part 2 is where it helps you to gauge whether the potentially adverse impacts that need further review are small, moderate, or large. Now, part 3, that's where you'll evaluate the moderate to large impacts that were identified in part 2. So you've left the small impacts kind of to the wayside a bit, and you're focusing in on those much more significant impacts, right? So those moderate to large impacts that came out of part 2 is what part 3 is going to focus on. Now, that's completed, like I said earlier, by the lead agency, and the lead agency will be the one to evaluate the significance of each impact in narrative form. Now, that includes a discussion of things like context, probability of occurrence, like if this impact that we're reviewing, if it'll actually happen or not, the duration or the potential duration of the impact, if it's irreversible, the geographic scope, magnitude, if there's any cumulative impacts, things of that sort. That's what's covered in part, that's what is discussed rather in narrative form by the lead agency in part 3. Now, sometimes the applicant or the sponsor may fill out the whole form for the short and the full EAF. They may do that by mistake, thinking that they're required to, or, you know, sometimes we don't always pay attention to directions, but just know that the applicant is only responsible for Part 1. It's lead agency's responsibility to fill out Part 2 and 3. If the applicant provides the whole thing filled out, you can really basically just disregard it. You would not accept that as the actual completion of Part 2 and Part 3. You would just use Part 1, discard the information, or ignore the information provided in Part 2 and 3, and then do your own substantive review using Part 2 and Part 3 of either the full or short EAF. So procedural compliance. Now, New York State courts have determined that both substantive and literal compliance is necessary when it comes to SEQR. So that basically means that the reviewing agencies must evaluate all potential impacts of an action and follow all of SEQR's procedural requirements. So if after reviewing the application a negative declaration is issued, for instance, a public hearing is required. If there's a positive declaration, for instance, a draft EIS is required. After either the public hearing, mainly because of a negative declaration, or accepting the draft EIS, the involved agencies must move forward with any underlying reviews related to the action. So that includes, for instance, site plan review, or a subdivision application. So basically what that means is that the review will take place concurrently with the evaluation of the draft EIS as it's circulated for comments. Basically what it means is that if it's circulated for, let me go back, I'm stumbling over myself. Basically it means that the draft EIS is circulated for comments at the same time that the site plan review is also happening. I'll leave it there. Keep in mind, SEQR is a requirement in and of itself. It's often rather triggered by local review requirements, like we mentioned earlier, like subdivision, that's part of the law, whether it's town, village, or city law. It's required that you do SEQR when you're doing a subdivision. And SEQR may also share some of the specific review elements that come along with some of your requirements in your local communities, but it cannot be used instead of local regulations, or the opposite, meaning like not used in favor of local regulations. So I'll say that again, SEQR cannot be used in place of local regulations. If they're, like, for instance, if they're similar, if they review the same thing or similar things, you can't use it instead of, you can't do it instead of doing your own, whatever your local requirement requires. And it also cannot be used in favor of a local regulation, or it cannot be disregarded, rather, in favor of a local regulation. You have to do them both, whatever your local requirement says, as well as SEQR. SEQR may be similar, but again, it is a separate and distinct requirement, and it does need to be completed. Next, we'll talk about the review, uncoordinated review. Basically, an uncoordinated review, rather, is when there's no lead agency. Each agency reviews a project independently, and they establish, establishing a lead, that's when establishing a lead agency isn't really necessary. Each agency will issue an individual determination of significance, and really this is only something that's available for unlisted actions, so not type 1 or type 2, and that's mainly because an unlisted action is less likely to be severe or have a significantly adverse impact. So that's why. But there's really one caveat to this, though. Even if an agency issues a positive declaration, then all the agencies must coordinate that one positive because that one positive declaration supersedes all negative declarations from other agencies. I'll say that one more time. An uncoordinated review is basically when there's no lead agency, and that's where each agency is reviewing the project independently. Now, if one agency issues a positive declaration, then all the agencies must coordinate. So that one positive declaration supersedes all the negative declarations from other agencies, and they have to begin again. This can get tricky if any of the other agencies has already granted a local approval under their jurisdiction, either at the same time or before the other agency's positive declaration, but the law accommodates for this. That approval is still considered to be valid, and it's not necessary to reopen SEQR. But if no one has already made, but if that or any other involved agency has not made a decision on SEQR or has not completed SEQR for themselves and made a decision on the application before them, and there's a positive declaration amongst several or other negative declarations, the process would need to start over. And coordinated review, basically it's the opposite of the uncoordinated review. It's one integrated environmental review among agencies, one or more agencies. One agency serves as the lead agency from among the involved agencies, and that lead agency keeps that role throughout the SEQR process. It's not something that can be delegated. Once it's yours, it is yours until SEQR is done. However, other involved agencies can support the review effort by providing information, you know, in their subject matter, in areas where they may be the subject matter expert, et cetera. And they can also provide comments, obviously. But that's what a coordinated review is. It is when there's a coordinated effort or integrated review among multiple parties, and they're all the involved agencies on that level. Next, Trish will talk about the criteria for determining significance.
All right, thank you, Ebony. So the criteria for determining significance, you know, this is where the rubber hits the road, we like to say in SEQR. So you determine that there will be an environmental impact, but how do you figure that out? So to determine whether a proposed type 1 or an unlisted action may have a significant adverse impact on the environment, the impacts that may be reasonably expected to result from the proposed action must be compared against the criteria in Part 617.7c. So this following list is illustrative, it's not exhaustive, and these criteria are considered indicators of significant adverse impacts on the environment. They include, you know, a reduction in wildlife habitat. You know, will you be, you know, when you're doing a residential subdivision, for example, if you're clear cutting all the trees, will you be impacting migratory bird paths or bat paths? Will there be a hazard to human health? You know, are we going to be using too much from our watersheds and now we won't have enough fresh water? Will there be a substantial change in the use of the land? Are we going from agricultural to an industrial use? And this is an important one. Is there a conflict with the adopted community plans or goals? Again, whatever project comes before you, take out the goals that are identified in your comprehensive plan and see if it's in harmony or if it's not. And if it's not, that's a pretty good indicator that this project might not be right, but it might be right if you can mitigate some adverse environmental impacts with conditions. And will you have impairment of community character? This is a pretty subjective one. You know you have community character and you know if you don't. I can't tell you if you have it or if you don't, or will this project impair that community character? Will it detract from what makes your community special? Ebony already mentioned that a lot of boards are already doing procedural compliance, but many local agencies put forth a lot of effort into the procedural or the literal requirements of SEQR, but in doing so, sometimes they neglect to honor the overall intent of the regulations, which is to consider the impacts to the environment as early in the process as possible. So by taking a substantive approach to the review, agencies should identify all relevant impacts and consider them relative to the magnitude, the duration, and their context. Any impacts identified will be used to make the determination of significance and will determine if the environmental impact statement, the EIS, will be required. The courts have also referred to this substantive review as taking a hard look when analyzing impacts. Maybe a lot of you will recognize this. It's the Carrier Dome in Syracuse. In this case, Holmes versus the New York State UDC back in 1979, the court concluded that there was a failure to consider all concerns, such as traffic, and so the action was nullified. So if anybody's attended a function here at the Carrier Dome, you know that traffic is indeed an impact of, fact of life when you're going to see anything there. But the review board didn't take a hard look at traffic when they approved this project. So the action was nullified, and this decision resulted in the expression hard look. So take a hard look at the overall impact that the project is going to have. And the determination of significance, either or a positive or a negative, must be in writing, and it must remain part of the record. And, you're going to want to make these juicy. You don't want short little statements in here, yes, it will be significant, or no, it won't be significant. You want to kind of bolster it in case you ever are challenged in the future, or another board or developer wants to look at the project going forward as an example. You're going to want to have some meat on the bone and explain in a little detail why you made your decision. And you certainly want to avoid segmentation. And segmentation divides a project into pieces, with each piece getting its own individual determination of significance. This can be an intentional or unintentional, and it may happen over time, which is very common with development. But either way, it could result in cumulative environmental impacts of an action to be overlooked. So you can see if you do things piecemeal a little bit at a time, you may not see the overall environmental impact, or maybe the straw that broke the camel's back of a project. So it's really not smart to do anything in pieces, and you want to avoid segmentation at all costs. And segmentation is not permitted except for very rare cases, and you should avoid it, like I said. How do you evaluate impacts? You have to take a look at an impact in terms of the project's context. And DEC provides these words, these guides, to help you when you're trying to figure out what the impact will be. And we use these terms: magnitude, duration, and likelihood. I mentioned before, SEQRA has its own language. And magnitude means, in terms of context, will this impact be moderate? Will it be localized to a specific geographical area? Or will it have a large or a severe impact? Duration could be, is this just during construction, or will it include post-construction as well? And these are pretty self-explanatory. Will it be short-term, for example, just during the construction phase? Will it be midterm, or will we have long-term consequences of this action? And, the worst one on this list is irreversible. If we go through with this project, are we going to be harming the environment in an irreversible way? And you should also ask yourself, what happens if we don't do this project? Will we have irreversible environmental impacts if we don't do something, or if we fail to do something or fix something now? And finally, we have likelihood. So before I mentioned, it's presumed that every project will have an environmental impact, but it's up to you to determine just how severe or likely, what are the odds that we're going to have an adverse environmental impact. So you can chop that down to, it's unlikely to happen, it will possibly happen, or it will probably happen. And again, this is the jargon, these are the words that DEC has provided to guide you when you are doing your review. And here's a good example, like a little case study we have to help you to kind of figure this out a little bit. This picture on the left is the Nicollet, it's a Target store in Nicollet, Minnesota, and on the right, this is the Crossgates Mall in Albany with the Colony landfill there in the background. That hill is not really a hill; it's a landfill that's been growing. And how do we consider these two projects within their own context? So on the project on the left, so they're both big box stores, but the project on the left is already in a city close to existing sewer and water, close to infrastructure like sidewalks and roads, close to access to public transit. Hopefully, maybe the parking is underground or on the rooftop. I'm not sure in this case. You also have to consider the police and the first responders, the ambulance, the fire, and the police. How often are they getting called out to this situation? Maybe they don't have as far to go in this centrally located downtown area, versus a project in the suburbs over here on the right with this giant parking lot, sea of parking lot. Did they chop down a lot of trees with this greenfield development before this? Is it already near existing sewer and water and sidewalks and bus lines? And is it walkable? Is it in a walkable neighborhood? And another question is, what is the economic impact? Ebony showed you a picture in the very beginning of a quaint little downtown. So what is the economic impact to other businesses in your area if you go through with this project? Will it be siphoning off vitality from the downtown or from your Main Street or certain other pockets that have retail going on, commercial areas? So you can request an economic impact study. And how often are the police and fire and first responders called out to this suburban area? Does it take them longer to get out there? So you're going to be evaluating the magnitude, the duration, and the likelihood of those impacts in the context of an individual project. And every site gets to have its own, dedicated context. You can't compare this Target to the Walmart out here in this other picture, because their physical areas are just so different. Their circumstances are just so very different. So you have to ask yourself, will this action have a potentially significant adverse environmental impact? If the answer is yes, then you provide a positive declaration. An EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, will be required. And if the answer is no, then you provide a negative declaration. And by the way, you probably have heard the terms neg-dec and pos-dec. They're just shortcuts for these terms. But if you have a neg-dec, then the environmental impact study is not required, and the SEQR process comes to its natural conclusion. And, again, it was one of those asterisks back in the very beginning of the show that showed you where SEQR can come to its natural end. And the process ends, and you just note that in your application and in your meeting minutes, and then you are all set. Now we are going on to the environmental impact statement. And so this is Ebony, and I will give her back the ball.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, the environmental impact statement. So let's say that we have a project with a positive declaration. That means that it has a potentially significant impact statement and requires an environmental impact statement. Excuse me, did I say that? Now I'm not even hearing myself as I speak. Let me say it one more time, make sure I get it right. So let's just assume, just for hypothesis sake, like just for giggles, we have a project with a positive declaration, and it has a positive, significant environmental impact. Now, in that case, we know that a positive, significant environmental impact will require an EIS, right, an environmental impact statement. But what exactly is that? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides, well, in this slide, really. Basically, an environmental impact statement is a disclosure document. It basically puts all the information out there, the impacts, the alternatives, the mitigation. It puts it all out there for consideration or review. And the goal really is to document the potential impacts that have been identified and that adverse impacts are mitigated or will be mitigated as much as possible. Remember we were talking about in the very beginning about how the environment is much broader than natural resources, right? It can incorporate human health and wildlife habitat and scenic vistas, farmland, et cetera. So the EIS is a tool to help weigh that social, economic, and environmental those different factors early on in the decision-making process. So just like what Trish was talking about earlier about neighborhood character, that downtown, that quaint downtown, you know, that's an aesthetic. That's something that is, I guess, kind of intangible, right? Doesn't really fit our traditional view or definition of what environment is, but again, our view when it comes to SEQR of environment, our view is much broader than just natural resources. So again, the EIS is intended to help you weigh all those different factors in your decision-making process. The EIS starts out as a draft. The initial statement is considered a draft or called a draft, and it's prepared by the lead agency or by the project sponsor or applicant, right? So either of those folks can do it. The applicant may be uninclined to do it. They may have to, because it will be costly to do. So the lead agency can decide to do it or hire a consultant to do it and pass along the cost, et cetera. But the draft EIS is circulated for review and comment among, it's circulated for review and comment, and it's basically an analysis of the environmental impacts and the ways that we will avoid them. So again, it's a document that lists out the potential impacts that have been identified and the adverse impacts that are going to be mitigated as much as possible. The goal here is not to be encyclopedic, but to be analytic, okay? So not exhaustive, but to certainly cover the main issues and evaluate them. It lays out all the alternatives to the action, including the denial, right? So not just, okay, these are the methods that we can use to employ to mitigate the issue or to address the impact, the potential impact, but this is also the consequence of denial. Denial is an option. This is what this, will do or can do. Scoping. Now, this is something that's a little bit different as we kind of move in from 2019 with the changes were made to SEQR. Scoping used to be optional. It is now something that is formally required. Scoping basically helps when you can't really address every conceivable issue or scenario, and that's just part of the kind of how this works, because remember, SEQR is an information gathering process, and you may have a lot of information, but you can't address every issue. You can't address every conceivable issue or scenario. So scoping allows you to focus in on those significant environmental impacts that come along with that proposed action, and then eliminate the insignificant ones. So, again, you're focusing on those very significant impacts, and the really insignificant ones you can put to the side and just focus on the big ticket items, so to speak. Without scoping, you risk missing important issues and information that affects local resources. But the biggest benefit to doing scoping is that you're able to identify alternatives to the proposed action, and you're able to identify options that minimize or avoid impacts. And again, scoping, there was a time where it was optional. Before January 2019, it was optional. Today, it is very much required. And so the result of doing scoping is that you have a document that is both concise and accurate, and it focuses on the significant issues and is ready for public review, right? This is, likely to be a lengthy document. You don't want to go cross-eyed reading through information that isn't as important to the overall action. You want to focus on those heavy-hitting items that are most important, right? Because again, you also don't want to get confused by, you know, all of the different items or things that come out of the review. And so again, that's another reason why scoping makes sense. You just focus on the things that are most important as opposed to getting bogged down in a lot of details around things that may not have a bearing anyway. So again, that's just another reason why scoping is a good idea, and now it's required. So you can be convinced, you just got to do it basically. So scoping also must include opportunities for public participation, including other agencies and including other agencies in identifying impacts. And the goal with that is to basically create consensus among the involved agencies, right, that are also reviewing this with you. So again, you have to include the public, they have to be able to participate, but you also have to include other agencies in helping to identify those impacts. Again, scoping is required for all EISs, with one exception though, and this is a supplemental EIS. That is still optional. It's still optional to do scoping on a supplemental EIS. Basically, a supplemental EIS is a document that will analyze one or more of the adverse environmental impacts that either wasn't adequately addressed in the draft or final EIS, or it wasn't addressed at all, right? Maybe there's something that new that came out of the information. Maybe there's a new development that's come up that could not have been foreseen, that was not an issue at the time. Maybe now it is, and you have to cover that. So that's where the supplemental EIS comes in, and for supplemental EIS, scoping is not required. One thing I also mentioned about the supplemental EIS is that it can also address site-specific effects of an action presented in a generic environmental impact study, and we'll get into that in the next slide. But before we do that, I also want to mention that another new item that came out of the regulations or the update to the regulations were that if some or all comments on the draft environmental impact statement are filed late, then they must be incorporated into the DEIS or added to its appendix by the project sponsor. So that's just another thing to be mindful of. Okay, so here we are, the generic environmental impact study. Now, site-specific or project-specific EISs are the most common type of EISs, but the generic EIS is broader, right? That's why it's called generic GEIS. It's broader, and it works for a program or a plan with a wide purpose or a conceptual project or something that's conceptual in nature or partially conceptual, like a phased development. For example, a GEIS can be used to assess the environmental impacts of a series of actions in an area where that may seem individually insignificant, but together they have a significant impact. And like I said earlier, a phased development is an example of that, where you can assess those cumulative impacts. Another example could be significant changes to zoning regulations or to a comprehensive plan. That's another example. GIS, just like the other documents that we've talked about so far, it should discuss logically the logic and rationale for the choices and options proposed in the document. It may also include an assessment of specific impacts. And again, like I mentioned earlier, may be conceptually based in some cases, depending on the project. And it may identify important natural resources, existing and projected cultural features, patterns, and characters. And it may also discuss constraints and consequences of hypothetical scenarios that could occur. Next, I believe Trish will talk about the preparation of a draft EIS. And I will pass the ball to her.
All right, thank you. So this document is prepared by, or it's caused to be prepared by, the lead agency. And ultimately, this document belongs to the lead agency. It is the initial statement that's circulated for review and comment. Obviously, because it's a draft, you're hoping to get some comments back. It's prepared by the project sponsor, or it's delegated to the lead agency to prepare. And the lead agency has to determine whether or not it's adequate enough for the draft DEIS for public review within 45 days. Otherwise, you have If you have to make changes, you have 30 days to resubmit that. And if it's unacceptable, try to give guidance and try to adhere to these time frames. Again, where are the seeker police? They don't exist. The obligations, more or less, are for the lead agency. The applicant or the sponsor really has no clock for responding. It only affects them in the long run by delaying their project. And the lead agency may charge the applicant fees to recover the actual costs for either preparing the draft and final environmental impact statements or for their review, but you can't charge them for both. It's an either or, no double dipping on that. And here we have more amendments to the SEQR regs. This regards the preparation of the EIS, and the procedures have been clarified to define when the draft is adequate enough for public review, and where it's relevant, and not always is, but where it is relevant, the draft EIS must evaluate measures to avoid or to reduce an action's impact on climate change and the associated impacts on flooding and sea level rise. So again, this is New York State addressing climate change and hoping to adapt to green infrastructure and low impact development so that we can accommodate the right kind of development in the right kind of places, because we are seeing rises in sea levels and more flooding and more frequent flooding and stormwater events, so we need to be prepared for those. And preparing the final EIS, boy, and Ebony is right, there are so many versions of this EIS, the EIS, the draft, the final, the generic, but finally we're on to the preparing the final version of this. So the lead agency is responsible for completing the final EIS within 45 days after you have the public hearing, but if you don't have a public hearing, then 60 days after the draft EIS notice of completion. And the notice of completion starts that 10-day period for any involved agencies and for the public to consider the final environmental impact statement. And the lead agency may issue those written findings after that. And finally, we have the notice of completion for the draft. These are in blue because when we used to present this live, these were hot links and they used to take you right out to the notice of completion. And you can get a lot of these forms right on the DEC's website under the SEQR. And the final EIS, what is in the final? And the final is really a compilation of the draft that's been revised to include any supplements if they were submitted, if that applies, and all of the comments that were received. And the lead agency is only responsible for replying to substantive comments. So if you get 500 people that show up and say this project is lousy, that's not really a substantive comment. Maybe they would want to respond to that once, but they don't have to respond 500 times to this project is lousy. They really want to respond to comments that have some merit or some worth or some, meat on the bones, as we say. And how do you post the scope and the environmental impact statement? The draft and the final scopes have to be noticed in the environmental notice bulletin. That is still a printed publication, and it is an online publication at the DEC and on their website. The draft and the final scopes, as well as a draft, a final, and the supplemental environmental impact statements must be posted on a publicly available website. So if you're a municipality that has a regularly updated website, you would have to put all this information up there. And, this is a way of the public following or tracking a project, especially now during the pandemic when people, you know, when we're not out in person as much attending meetings and hearings, this is a good way for the public to stay involved. And, you know, this has been happening before the pandemic, but just know that it is a requirement. And wrapping it up with your decision-making and your findings, and findings really connect the dots between your laws and local regulations and why, you know, why you are approving or denying a project. And when you're drafting your findings, you have to consider all of the information in the final environmental impact statement. And you need to balance all of those environmental factors. You know, it really is a balancing game because you're trying to help the community and help the environment versus what the developer or the applicant wants to achieve on their end. You have to provide the rationale for your decision. Again, don't put conclusory statements like, we like this project or it's a good project. You really need to supplement your findings with good information in case you ever are challenged or people in the future wonder why you made a decision the way you did. You can look back and figure out the rationale, the method to why you made your choices or why you imposed certain conditions. And findings, they help the review board or the agency because they certify, they show in paper that you followed the rules. And they certify that whatever you chose as an alternative to mitigate adverse environmental impacts to the extent possible or to the extent practicable, that you considered these things, that you just weren't whimsical. And these are all things that will help you if you are challenged in the future. And your findings and your final decision may be made concurrently. And again, these underlined in blues, they were hot linked to actual sites on the DEC website. So sorry about those, they're not active right now. But there is a seeker finding form on the DEC website, and we can certainly send you that link or send you that form if you email us. And here is the New York State Department of State, Division of Local Government. This is our phone number where you can contact us or you can email us with questions. And DEC, here is their contact information as well. You know, they don't have as many people dedicated to SEQR over there as they used to, but they do have people that can assist you with questions, or we could assist you with questions. Either way, we're here to help you, and you will get 2 hours of training credit for this evening's, for attending this evening's presentation. So I guess we could open it up to questions now.
Well, there was a flurry of them earlier, and I think we have a couple that have just come in. Ebony, you've gotten a few, haven't you? You had one individually, and then did you respond to it? I think you responded to it, but didn't hear back from the questioner.
Yes, that question was, see if I can find it. Unless you already have it up, Chris. Let me see.
I do.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, it was actually, no, I have your answer. I don't have the question itself. So while you're looking for that, I'll go through a few others. There's one person who needs handouts. We'll handle that a little later. And there's one question, involved versus interested. Lead agency must send notifications to involved but not interested agencies, correct. The lead agency should send notifications to everyone, initially to those agencies that want to receive, want to be part of the coordinated review, should receive should respond that they would like to participate and they would like to weigh in, and that's how it should be handled. I'll double check on the requirement to send to interested parties. I'm pretty sure everyone who expresses an interest, when the lead agency first receives the application and then goes out and says, we declare lead agency, do you, are you okay with that? Anybody who responds and says we would like to be part of this process should receive, should be involved in the decision, and those interested parties should weigh in. You know, what we might do is get a better, a more definitive answer, checking the regulations on that. But I'm pretty sure everyone should be in the loop. Everyone who expresses an interest in receiving those documents, being part of that conversation. Ebony, were you able to find your the original question?
Yes, the question was, and I think it was answered actually. I think it was in relation to an earlier question about the where does GML county GML, oh, now I'm not remembering, 239 M with county referral, where does that fit into the timeline? I think that's what this question referred to. The question is there a flow chart that illustrates this and the various sequences it can follow? And Chris mentioned this earlier, but it doesn't, the county referral doesn't really fit into the timeline for SEQR, but if you're not referring to that, because I wasn't clear if you were asking the question about county referral or if you were just speaking about SEQR in general. If you're speaking about SEQR in general, we do have a little flow chart that kind of lays out the process in the front of the presentation. It's like within the first 10 slides, I believe, somewhere along there. But if that's not the question, feel free to clarify. We have a few minutes left before we're scheduled to wrap up, so feel free. I don't see anything else coming up in the chat just yet, so that's about it.
Anybody else? Somebody says, if we have further questions, do we call the 518 number on the last slide? Yes, you can call that number, but we are still working remotely because our office is so densely populated and our building is so densely populated that we've been encouraged to continue working remotely because all of the social distancing guidelines are difficult to adhere to with as many people working at our building at 99 Washington Avenue in Albany as there are. And so if you leave a message at that number, we will get the message. Our secretary checks general messages and emails us. So we can call you back, but another option for you is to email us at localgov@dos.ny.gov. We have a general email address. And we can, that questions to that email address are distributed to us. So yes, by all means, if you have further questions, please do let us know. And I am looking into the question that I addressed a little earlier about the courtesy to interested parties. I've never had quite that question. I've always assumed that everyone who responds gets that they're interested and involved, they want to be involved, should. And there's the local gov at dos.ny.gov. Actually, that was from that looks like it was from the participant. I was going to type it in, but I'm gonna send it. It was from the questioner. I'm gonna email it to, or I'm gonna put in chat our general email address for everybody to see. So I'm gonna respond. I'm gonna double check my answer to the question that came up about the interested versus involved, who gets what. And maybe what we can do is we will send the answer to that to Sarah, what I find in the regulations to Sarah, and she can forward it to everybody on the who was in the webinar. Anybody else? And Trish and Ebony, did you have anything to add to that? Oh, it looks like Trish lost power. Not a moment
yes.
too late. So Trish is off the
yes.
webinar. There was a pretty severe thunderstorm here just a few minutes ago, so maybe it got to Trish's house. And David, did you have anything? I see that you're unmuted.
No, I do not. I am good.
Okay. How can we get the documents you referenced? The handouts should have been sent. You should have received all of the handouts upon registering. But if you didn't, let us know. Send an email to localgov@dos.ny.gov, and we'll respond with those handouts. And I'm going to check the SEQR regulations and the SEQR handbook, which are all on the SEQR website. You can just do a search for SEQR handbook or SEQR regulations. They come right up if you'd like to check those yourself. And if you have any other specific questions, you can send them to localgov@dos.ny.gov. And if you have any other specific questions, the documents you referenced, I'm assuming that's those are the handouts that you're referring to. Okay. We will email those to you. David, do you see that question? And can you send the handouts to the two people who have requested them on this in the chat?
For the handout? Yeah, I'll
Great.
just do it.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
David handled the registration, so he has everybody's email address, and he can connect the. Oh, there goes my power.
Oh no. Well, it sounds like, I don't know if that also means that Chris is. Are you still there?
I can hear you, Ebony, but I think maybe that's just because you're connected by phone, but my computer just went down. So I think our webinar is over, at least at my end. So if you have if you want to address any questions with the time remaining, go ahead.
There don't seem to be any other questions, and I can still see your little, oh, nope, I don't see you doing your volume anymore. I don't know. But in any case, that was our presentation on SEQR. We thank you so much for joining us. I don't see any other questions here, and my lights are flickering here at my home now too. How strange. Well, anyway, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope that you will join us at another webinar very soon.
We were lucky to get through it. Thank you, everyone.